The word is German. From heroisch, heroic. Bayer trademarked it in 1898, and it was printed in 21 languages in their product catalog. By 1899, they were exporting it to 23 countries. The dose listed for children's cough syrup was 0.65 milligrams per serving. That is the number that stopped me. Not the addiction, not the casualties. The dose, printed in the catalog. For children. By the company that made aspirin. A pharmacy counter in 1900. Glass jars on tiered shelves. Acetyl salicylic acid, Bayer's aspirin, on one side of the counter. Diacetyl morphine, Bayer's heroin, on the other. Both in the same white packaging with the same Bayer cross. Both launched within a year of each other. Both available without a prescription. The family that sent their child in with a coin for the cough remedy did not know they were purchasing a compound that crossed the blood-brain barrier faster than morphine. They knew only what the label said. And the label said, non-addictive. There is a document, written in 1897. It is a clinical trial summary from Bayer's own laboratories in Elberfeld, Germany. It predates the marketing copy by 1 year. It predates the word non-addictive, appearing on any label by at least a year. And the pharmacologist who supervised those trials was the same man who approved the marketing language that followed them. The question I kept returning to, between the 1897 clinical file and the 1898 copy approval, what exactly was read and by whom, and what decision was made about what the public would be told? If you enjoy these stories, support the channel by subscribing and liking. Now back to the story. To understand why that question matters, you have to understand what American medicine looked like at the turn of the century. Specifically, what it looked like for pain. In 1898, the United States did not have a Food and Drug Administration. It did not have controlled substance scheduling. It did not have federal oversight of pharmaceutical marketing claims. It had the patent medicine industry, a largely unregulated market of bottled preparations whose ingredients were not required to be disclosed, whose efficacy claims were not required to be tested, and whose advertising ran freely in newspapers and medical journals alike. And at the center of that market sat a crisis that the industry had partly created: morphine addiction. By 1900, estimates placed the number of morphine-dependent Americans at between 200,000 and 300,000. Morphine had been distributed freely during the Civil War as a battlefield painkiller, so freely and to so many wounded soldiers that morphine addiction was sometimes called soldier's disease in the years that followed. After the war, it remained available without prescription. It was in patent medicines, in tonics, in syrups marketed to women for menstrual pain and to children for teething. The addiction crisis was visible, documented, and widely discussed in the medical press. Physicians were actively looking for a morphine substitute, something that would control pain and suppress cough without producing the dependency they were now watching, in patient after patient, destroy the ability to function. That is the market Bayer was entering. That is the specific gap they were designing a product to fill. And that is the reason the word non-addictive was not incidental to their marketing campaign. It was the entire campaign. It was the reason physicians would choose heroin over the alternatives they already had. In 1898, calling a product non-addictive was not a vague wellness claim. It was a direct answer to the most pressing clinical problem in American medicine. And the company making that claim had, 1 year earlier, completed the clinical trials that told them whether it was true. The structure of Bayer's distribution channel was specific. The American medical press, journals that reached physicians in their offices, in the practices where the prescribing decisions were made, was carrying Bayer advertising. Free samples went to those same physicians by mail. 3 grams, enough to test the compound on patients. Enough for a physician to observe its effects firsthand and conclude, based on that short-term observation, that the company's non-addictive claim was plausible. The clinical arc of heroin dependency, the building tolerance, the physical withdrawal symptoms that emerge over weeks and months of use, was not visible in a brief physician trial. It would only become visible in the patient who returned and returned again and began to need the compound in ways that looked different from a persistent cough. This is the system that existed before the Harrison Act of 1914. We have not yet arrived at the document, but we are close. The pharmacologist at the center of this story is a man named Heinrich Draeser. He was head of pharmacology at Bayer's Elberfeld laboratory, and in 1896 he was assigned to evaluate a compound that had first been synthesized 22 years earlier, in 1874, by an English chemist named C.R. Alder Wright, who had acetylated morphine to see what happened and filed the result away without pursuing it commercially. Draeser ran animal trials in 1896 and human trials in 1897. The human subjects were primarily Bayer laboratory workers and patients at a clinic associated with the trials. What the trials documented was tolerance development. The subjects required increasing doses to achieve the same effect. That is the clinical definition of the dependency mechanism. It is not a subtle finding. It is not a borderline result. It is the central pharmacological characteristic that distinguishes a safe compound from a dangerous one in the context of chronic administration. Here is the part which will shock you. Draeser had a royalty arrangement with Bayer. He received a financial share of revenue from every product he brought to market. He had the same arrangement for aspirin, launched the following year. For heroin, his royalty on each unit sold gave him a direct and compounding financial incentive in the product's commercial success, and a direct and compounding financial incentive in the marketing language that would drive that success. He was not a neutral evaluator of his own trial data. He was a shareholder in its outcome. In 1898, Draeser presented heroin to the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians. His paper described the compound as a respiratory sedative useful for cough and as a treatment for morphine addiction. He described its safety profile favorably. The clinical trial data showing tolerance development in the 1,897 human subjects was not prominently featured. The paper was the opening document of the public record on heroin. It was also the document that set the terms within which every subsequent claim would be evaluated, because it was the first scientific word by the man who ran the trials in a peer-reviewed forum. When Draeser's colleague Felix Hoffmann had synthesized aspirin, a subtle salicylic acid, the year before, Draeser had initially given it low priority. He had focused his attention on heroin, the compound whose royalty structure he had arranged and whose commercial prospects he was actively promoting. When aspirin eventually reached market in 1899, its success became the story history told. Heroin, which launched first, was not the story history told, but it was the product that launched first. The 1898 marketing copy followed. The specific word used in Bayer's materials, non-addictive, was not a loose adjective or a vague claim. It was a deliberate product differentiator from codeine and morphine, placed in advertising copy distributed through the American medical press to the specific audience of physicians who were most concerned about addiction and most actively looking for an alternative. The word was chosen because it answered the question that would otherwise have prevented the sale. Now look here carefully, because this is the sequence that is difficult to explain away. The clinical trial summary exists. It is from 1897. It documents tolerance development in the human subjects. The marketing copy calling the product non-addictive is from 1898. The man who supervised the trials and the man who approved the marketing language are the same man. And the financial arrangement that compensated him for bringing the product to market successfully was already in place before the trials began. I want to be careful here. Tolerance development in a short-term clinical trial is not identical to long-term physical addiction. The science of addiction in 1897 was not the science of addiction today. It is possible that Draeser looked at his own data and genuinely concluded that the dependency mechanism he observed in a short trial would not produce the clinical addiction pattern he had seen with morphine in long-term use. It is possible that he was wrong in good faith. It is also possible to note what his financial arrangement was, what his data showed, and what word appeared in the marketing copy. All three of those things are documented. The audience can assess the proximity. What Bayer did with the product after launch was methodical. They distributed free samples to physicians through the American medical press. 3 grams per physician, a substantial quantity. They listed heroin in their 1900 catalog alongside aspirin, with indicated uses including coughs, bronchitis, tuberculosis, and the treatment of morphine addiction. The particular cruelty of that last indication, marketing a more rapidly dependency-producing compound as the cure for dependency on the less rapidly dependency-producing compound it was derived from, was not apparent to the physicians who prescribed it, because the clinical file that would have made it apparent was in an Elberfeld laboratory and not in their offices. The American Medical Association Journal accepted Bayer's heroin advertising continuously through 1903. The AMA was, at this period, not the regulatory body it later became. It was a professional association in the process of distinguishing legitimate medicine from patent medicine quackery, actively trying to separate itself from the unregulated market, while simultaneously accepting advertising revenue from a product being marketed with a clinical claim the advertiser knew to be at minimum questionable. The advertising appeared in the same publication that was arguing, editorially, for evidence-based standards in pharmaceutical marketing. And now, we get to the part that no one talks about. Bayer's heroin sold. It sold extensively. By the early 1900s, heroin addiction was appearing in clinical literature with increasing frequency, described not as a theoretical risk, but as a documented clinical reality, presenting in patients who had been prescribed heroin for cough, for respiratory illness, for the treatment of the morphine addiction they had been given heroin to cure. Physicians writing in the medical press began documenting cases. They described patients who had been told the compound was non-addictive. They described the difficulty of withdrawal. The cases accumulated, but the product remained available, remained in the catalog, remained in the children's cough syrup formulations being sold across the counter in pharmacies. Because the formal mechanism that would require a company to remove a dangerous product from the market did not yet exist. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed on December 17, 1914, 16 years after the 1898 marketing copy and 17 years after the 1897 clinical file. What ended Bayer's heroin sales was not the clinical evidence accumulating in the medical press. It was federal legislation. The documentation of harm did not, on its own, remove the product from shelves. The documentation of harm sat alongside the product on shelves for 16 years. Bayer's heroin revenue during those 16 years was not incidental. At its commercial peak, heroin represented a meaningful share of Bayer's American pharmaceutical revenue. The company did not voluntarily cease marketing before the legislation required it. There is no record of Bayer revising the non-addictive claim in response to the clinical literature appearing in the medical press. There is no record of the free sample program being suspended when the case reports began accumulating. The program continued until the law made it impossible to continue. The living proof of this template is not in a foreign country and does not require crossing a border. It is in the sequence used by Purdue Pharma to market OxyContin beginning in 1995. A clinical claim that OxyContin's time-release formula made it less addictive than immediate-release opioids. A medical press distribution campaign. Physician samples. Marketing directed at the specific gap in pain management that physicians were most frustrated by. A financial incentive structure for the representatives making the claims. And internal documents produced during litigation beginning in the early 2000s that showed Purdue's own data contradicted the addiction risk claims in their marketing materials. The template is not an accident. It is a product category, a compound with documented dependency risk, a marketing claim that addresses the dependency risk by denying it, and a distribution strategy built around the specific professional gatekeepers who most need to believe the denial. Bayer ran it in 1898. The playbook was not destroyed when heroin was scheduled. It was archived. What happened to the knowledge of the 1897 clinical file? It is a precise question with an imprecise answer, which is itself a kind of answer. Bayer's Elberfeld laboratory records from this period are not publicly accessible in any comprehensive way. The company became part of a larger chemical conglomerate, IG Farben, in 1925. After World War II, IG Farben was dissolved by the Allied Control Council and its component companies reconstituted. Bayer reemerged as an independent company in 1951. What traveled with it through that reconstitution, which internal records, which laboratory archives, which trial documentation, is not cataloged in any publicly available index. The clinical trial records that preceded the 1898 marketing copy are known to have existed because they are referenced in Dreeser's 1898 presentation. Whether the originals are still held somewhere, in what form, and whether they have been reviewed by any independent researcher is not established in the public record. A document that should be the foundational exhibit in any historical account of pharmaceutical marketing ethics. Last referenced clearly in 1898, whose current location and accessibility are not established in any public record. The company that holds it, if it still exists, has not published it. The researchers who should need it most have not cited it. Its absence from the contemporary literature is total. That absence is worth noting. A pharmacy counter in 1900, glass jars, the Bayer cross on both packages, the child with the coin sent for the cough remedy, receiving what the label said was safe, what the label said was non-addictive, what the catalog said was appropriate for their age and their condition. If the 1897 clinical trial documentation showed tolerance development in human subjects, and if the man who supervised those trials and approved the 1898 marketing language received royalties on every unit sold, and if the word non-addictive was a deliberate differentiator chosen to answer the specific clinical concern that would otherwise have prevented physician adoption, who made the decision about what word to use, and what did they do with the document that was already on their desk when they made it? If the American Medical Association Journal accepted that, advertising through 1903 while simultaneously running editorial content, arguing for evidence-based pharmaceutical standards, what does that tell us about whose evidence was being evaluated and by what standard? If the template of a dependency-producing compound marketed as non-addictive using physician sample distribution and medical press advertising was used again in 1995 with the same basic structure and produced a crisis that has killed, by current estimates, over 500,000 Americans, was anything actually learned from 1898? Or was the lesson that the template works until the legislation catches up, and that by the time the legislation catches up, the revenue has already been collected? The Bayer cross is still on products in your medicine cabinet. The company is still there. The laboratory in Elberfeld is still there. The 1897 clinical file is somewhere. What is not there, what was never there, was any mechanism that required the word on the label to match what was in the document that preceded it. There still isn't.